2017 be concurred in. Debate the Honourable Minister of Infrastructure and Communities.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I welcome the opportunity to be here this evening to talk about infrastructure. Infrastructure Canada has an unusual history. It originally operated as a program known as the Infrastructure National Office, which was administered by the Treasury Board Secretariat until it was established as a department. Between 2006 and 2016, the department has operated under various portfolios, often sharing ministries and deputy ministers. My predecessor, the Honourable Member for Lac Saint Jean, was also responsible for other departments when he was the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities. He held the Transport Canada portfolio for a period of time. He was the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs and President of the Queen's Privy Council, and he was the Minister of Economic Development Agency of Canada for the regions of Quebec. So Infrastructure Canada, Mr. Speaker, until November 2015, was never a stand-alone department with a dedicated minister and a dedicated deputy minister and their support staff. As Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs and President of Queen's Privy Council, the Honourable Member of Lac Saint Jean was able to make use of the office space associated with these positions. In November 2015, a dedicated Minister for Infrastructure Canada was appointed, and Transport Canada and Infrastructure Canada were separated into two different departments. But one deputy minister remained in place with the responsibility for both departments, and he sat with Transport Canada employees in their dedicated office space and building a few blocks away from Infrastructure Canada. On March 2, 2016, just over 3 months ago, a dedicated deputy minister for infrastructure was appointed. The same month, our government announced the first phase of our $120 billion 10-year plan to invest in Canadian communities. We committed to invest more than $10 billion in the next 2 years into our government's priorities: public transit, green infrastructure, and social infrastructure. But being able to deliver tangible results for Canadians requires space where we can work collaboratively and efficiently. We required offices for our support staff. When I was first appointed, my colleague, the Minister of Transport, was kind enough to loan us some office space in the short term. We looked at various options, Mr. Speaker, including continued operations out of Transport Canada offices. But ultimately, Mr. Speaker, the best option was to build a separate office space to consolidate all of our staff to one floor. The department worked with the Public Services and Procurement Canada to find space and create new accommodations. Our working space, Mr. Speaker, for up to 32 staff members was created in accordance with the Treasury Board and Public Services and Procurement Canada guidelines. And as per the Treasury Board guidelines, Mr. Speaker, Public Services and Procurement Canada reviewed the contracts and made sure there were no concerns from the Government of Canada's perspective. And in full support of Government of Canada's commitment to openness and transparency, we proactively disclosed these expenses publicly last April. We bought furniture for 32 office spaces. We bought furniture for collaborative spaces, for boardrooms, where we can hold our meetings. We also purchased furniture for the reception area, Mr. Speaker, so that visitors can sit while they wait to meet with our team. And to be clear, Mr. Speaker, the cost to build and furnish the space for 32 people, including an office for myself, the Deputy Minister, and our support staff, and the reception area was $835,000. When I took office in November, Mr. Speaker, I committed to working in collaboration with my provincial, territorial, and municipal partners. I committed to working in collaboration with our stakeholders, Indigenous peoples, and our key partners. And I have done so. I have met with mayors, wardens, premiers, chiefs, parliamentarians, and ministers. I have met with stakeholder organizations like the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the Saskatchewan Urban Municipalities Association, the Alberta Municipalities Association, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, the Canadian Urban Transit Association, and the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships. Mr. Speaker, in fact, after my visit to the city of Red Deer last March, Mayor Tara Weir said this, and I quote, "The fact that a sitting federal infrastructure minister came to Red Deer, to me bodes well for recognition of mid-sized cities and regional hubs. But it also built a relationship with the minister and our region so that in future there's an open door for the municipalities of our region." End quote. I have also met with city organizations like Board of Trade for Metropolitan Montreal and the Vancouver and Toronto Board of Trades. And I have met with chiefs and elders from Treaty 6 and chiefs from Treaty 8. I have met with Assembly of First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde and with Fort McMurray Métis and Saskatchewan chiefs just last month. And it's through working closely with these partners and stakeholders and listening to their priorities for their communities that we have made it to where we are today. So where are we today, Mr. Speaker? We are delivering on our commitment to invest more than $120 billion over the next 10 years. We announced in March that we would be providing more than $10 billion of new money over the next 2 years for public transit, green infrastructure, and social infrastructure, starting right away. We established Clean Water and Wastewater Fund, worth $2 billion, and the Public Transit Fund, worth $3.4 billion, and shared the allocation details with provinces and territories. And our discussions around bilateral agreements with provinces and territories are going very well, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we will have good news to share very soon. These agreements will allow us to start investing infrastructure funds and start funding new projects retroactive to April 1st, 2016. Since Canadians elected our government, we have announced 164 projects for nearly $300 million in federal funding across the country, leveraging almost $800 million of investment in Canadian communities. Investment that will create jobs, grow the economy, and bring opportunity for the middle class. But we are not coasting on our successes, Mr. Speaker. We are building on them. When we announced $10 billion in Budget 2016 for our infrastructure investments, we said it was for infrastructure work that can begin right away. We encouraged our partners to think of rehabilitation work that had to be put off for too long. We said we wanted to renew the existing infrastructure, while we worked toward a plan that would support the long-term infrastructure investments that we know are also needed. And we are referring to that as phase 2 of our plan. And this is the phase that will focus on large-scale projects that take years to plan, design, and build. Projects that we know our partners want to do and that will have a transformative effect on our communities. We have committed to announcing phase 2 of the long-term plan in the next year. It will be built through collaborative discussions and consultations so we can meet the needs of communities across this country. Through the coming summer months, Mr. Speaker, I will continue to engage with my provincial, territorial, and municipal partners. I will be engaging with Indigenous peoples and other key stakeholders to craft a plan that meets their needs. This includes attending conferences and events where we can host ministerial roundtables. My staff and I have reached to all of our colleagues on both sides of the House to make sure we hear from Canadians across the country. My parliamentary secretary is leading these consultations, and he will speak more about them later. In my time as a bus driver, as an Edmonton City Councillor, now as a federal minister, I have conducted myself in an open and transparent manner. I have spoken at length about my belief in principles of collaborative working relationships, of partnerships, of honest, direct communication. I have held myself to a high standard, and I have expected my office to act in the same manner. In that spirit, Mr. Speaker, my department has posted on our website an unprecedented level of information, including the funding remaining in existing programs for each province and territory. We have posted project-level information and funding amounts for all of our programs on the government's open data portal. We have shared the letters that we sent to provinces and territories that specifically detail the allocation under new infrastructure programs and the changes we have made to old programs. As I mentioned earlier, the cost that we incurred as part of the setup of the new office for up to 32 people were posted in that same spirit of openness and transparency. Mr. Speaker, people often ask, why do we include social infrastructure as part of our broader infrastructure plan? People think that investing in roads, bridges, transit, water, wastewater is the only infrastructure investments we can make. Those are very important and critical investments. Were we committed to invest in social infrastructure because we feel that investment into affordable housing, investment into ending violence against women, investments into early learning, investment into culture, recreational facilities will unlock people's potential. I have experienced the power of infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. I am the Minister of Infrastructure, but I'm also the infrastructure because of infrastructure. I'm the minister because of infrastructure. The transit buses that I took to work, the libraries where I went to learn English, changed my life. And the people that got on my bus, the people that I took to work, the people that came home from work after spending the day at work using public transit, those are the people on their behalf we build the infrastructure. So let me close, Mr. Speaker, by telling you a story. A story of a young mother of 3 children. A young mother who was on the verge of being homeless. She called my municipal office looking for support, looking for help. And we were able to provide her a secure, stable, affordable place to live through agencies that serve Edmontonians. Within that 1 year, Mr. Speaker, the mother was able to turn her life around. Her children were back in school. They were succeeding in school. And she had a job that she could hold, because that access to housing, that access to support services that she needed to put her life together, that is the power of infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. That is why we are investing in communities. And that's why we need to do it now. And that's why we are investing $120 billion into public infrastructure, in public transit, in green infrastructure, in social infrastructure, to make our communities more inclusive and welcoming places for people to live, to make our communities more resilient to climate change, to make sure that we invest in projects that matter to Canadians from one coast to the other coast to the other coast. That is our vision for infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. That is why we have created a dedicated ministry with a dedicated minister, with a dedicated deputy minister, and with dedicated staff, with a dedicated space to deliver on those commitments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Listening to the member's speech, clearly infrastructure is very important to him. So could he provide us with what, in his view, is the definition of infrastructure?
The honourable member for Infrastructure and Communities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I feel honored to answer that question from my honourable colleague. Because as I said earlier, infrastructure is about unlocking people's potential. Infrastructure is about public transit. Infrastructure is about having a safe place for people to go home to. Infrastructure is about providing a home for a person who doesn't have a place because they end up living on the street because of circumstances they don't control. Infrastructure is about a woman fleeing domestic violence, Mr. Speaker, where she can find a safe haven and escape that violence. Infrastructure is about early learning facilities for our little ones, so we can invest in their future to unlock their potential. So infrastructure is about everything, each and every day, that we Canadians use. Whether they're buses that take us to work, whether the water, wastewater facilities that we don't notice because our municipalities have done a good job of running those, or the wastewater facilities, or the clean water, or the investments that we're making into social infrastructure. So it is about people, Mr. Speaker.
Some comments. The honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the minister making himself available to this House for questions, and also for providing some context for the $835,000 figure when this House starts to look that it's for 32 different employees. My question to the minister is, I want to know, first of all, if he can tell this House how many employees in the previous government were dedicated just to infrastructure when the Infrastructure and Transport Canada were together. If you can compare and contrast that number with the 32 he has now, and maybe provide Canadians with a little bit more explanation on some of the different roles that those 32 employees do, because I think that's what Canadians really want in the spirit of transparency and openness, to make sure that our government resources are being used as efficiently and cost efficiently as possible. Thank you.
The honourable minister for Infrastructure and Communities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. When I was appointed Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, Mr. Speaker, I did not have any staff. So I had to start from the scratch. I had to build my ministry from the scratch. The only person that was giving me support was the Deputy Minister that I shared with the Transport Canada. So I had to hire a new Chief of Staff. I had to hire parliamentary secretaries. I had to hire my departmental, political, non-exempt staff. We have close to 24 people working in my office now, Mr. Speaker, with the potential to grow up to 32 people, because we are doubling our investments in infrastructure. $60 billion, from $60 billion, we're going to $120 billion over the next 10 years. So I have those staff members and with the potential to grow those staff members. Thank you so much.
Commentaire. Alors,